Cerca. Love the world you live in, and we'll help you explore it. I moved to Napa in July of 2015, just like weeks before harvest started. And my wine director, because I was working at this brand new restaurant as a sommelier, he was making wine. And he asked me and my colleague to come by and lend a hand on the day the grapes were picked. Now, rewind a little bit to back in New York. I had been learning everything I knew about wine from books and the occasional winery visit that I got to go on. So I really hadn't had any experience with the actual production of wine. And what I knew from books was that wine was made in tanks, and all the things that we thought we knew about I Love Lucy with the grape-stomping, that wasn't a thing. That wasn't how wine was made. I arrived at the winery, and the first thing I see is my wine director in a very short pair of shorts, thigh deep in grapes, stomping on them. And I looked at him and he was like, "Come on over, we're making wine." And I said, "This isn't how you make wine. It's supposed to be in the winery." And he said, "No, we're stomping grapes because I like my Pinot to be a little bit less extracted, and the gentle foot tread of my feet actually makes for a better wine." And it was in that moment that I realized that I knew absolutely nothing about winemaking. Everything that I had read in the books was to some degree correct, but there were a lot of variables that I had yet to understand. And that was a perfect example of something that I thought wasn't really done anymore that I later learned was actually a really big technique that was used by smaller producers and pretty regularly around the world. Winemaking is extraordinarily simple in concept. We've already sort of broken down in previous episodes that wine is made through fermentation. It's relatively uncomplicated. Grapes, which is your sugar, plus yeast, yields alcohol and CO2. And yet, there are almost an infinite amount of variables and permutations that winemakers will employ to affect the outcome. It is unbelievable to watch this happen in motion. And the reason that we see so many different styles of wines, even within one region, even from the same grape, has a lot to do with what happens in the actual winery itself. And while this might feel a little bit overwhelming to hear, this is actually a huge part of the appeal when traveling to wine regions. I am still amazed, even after all these years, when I go to different regions and I see them doing something just a little bit different, something that I didn't even know still existed or even existed to begin with in the wine world. It is so much fun to dive into when you're there, but it does require a little explanation on the front end to fully appreciate what's happening. So let's break down how wine is made, where some of those variables are, and of course, what to look for when you're visiting the winery. I think to begin, we have to talk about the fact that there are three primary components of winemaking. The first is harvest, the second is fermentation, and the third is aging. Those are the three biggest 10,000-foot view things that you need to fully understand, and there can be a ton of permutations within that we'll dive into in a second. Each one has their own set of variables, so as a wise nun turned nanny once told or sang to us, let us start at the very beginning, harvest. Grapes are harvested once per year. In the Northern Hemisphere, that's going to be between mid-August for your whites and sparkling, all the way into late October. And in the Southern Hemisphere, that's about mid-February to late April. Now, depending on the vineyard, the grape will either be harvested by hand or by machine. And like most things in life, while machines are cheaper, they are not without their downsides. Harvest is one of my favorite experiences to watch. It is amazing and fast-paced if you're lucky enough to be around to see it, that is. Because in many regions, the grapes that are harvested in the middle of the night or in the early hours of the morning when it's cooler to preserve the acidity and prevent that afternoon heat from spoiling the grapes or even kicking off fermentation a little early. That is a winemaker's nightmare. And while I know many of you would love to get in on the process, and I do recommend getting your hands dirty once in a while to try it, I do have to warn you that having done it firsthand, it is a lot harder than it looks, and you will be woefully slow compared to the pros who do this for a living. So let's talk about some of the variables that can exist within harvest. Vines can look wildly different from region to region, especially in places where grapes are planted to hillsides and terraces. So things that you should be paying attention to are, what do those grapevines look like? Are they planted on slopes? Are they planted on mountains? Those are things that are going to affect how those grapes are actually harvested, because a lot of places that are difficult to get to, you can't use a machine. You have to do it by hand. The other thing that you need to be paying attention to is how those vines are trained. So you have to think about it like you would any other plant. The way that you cut that vine is going to determine how it's going to grow. And in certain places, you'll see lots of different training and trellising systems. And each one is often really unique to that specific place. One of my favorite examples of this was recently when I was in Vinho Verde in Portugal. I noticed that a lot of the vines were planted 6 to 7 feet tall in what's called these pergola training systems. And the history behind that was fascinating and actually lends itself to the actual culture of grape growing and winemaking of that region, which is once upon a time, grapes were not the main production of the region, and in fact still really isn't. So what they did was they planted the vines super, super high around the perimeter of the vineyard so that they could plant other crops underneath and between it. And that's sort of what lent itself to the style of winemaking. So trellising and training are incredibly important, not only to the culture and the history of the region, but also how those wines are going to taste. All right, once those grapes are harvested, then they're going to be brought into the winery where they're going to be destemmed, because of course we're not harvesting grape by grape, we're harvesting cluster by cluster. So they're going to be destemmed, sorted for quality, because not every berry that's grown on the vine is going to be perfect. So we're going to make sure that every single berry is up to our quality. And then they're going to be sorted for any remaining debris, because sometimes when you're harvesting, you get a little extra stuff in there. You get some leaves, you get some twigs, some non-fruit things that aren't going to be super delicious when we get to that actual fermentation step. Now, this is where the process for red, white, and rosé start to diverge a little bit. Let me back up. If you've ever squeezed a grape, which I think as kids we probably have all done, you'll probably notice that the juice that comes out isn't red, it's clear. Doesn't matter what color the grape skin is, it's mostly clear. And this is true for 99% of wine grape varieties. All grape juice is clear. So to make a red wine, the skin has to come into contact with that juice. And yes, for those of you who are paying close attention, that does mean you can make a white wine from red grapes. But in order to get that red color, they do have to spend a little time together macerating. More on that in a second. For white wine, we don't actually want that juice to come into contact with the skins. If we did, we would have what's called an orange wine. Super popular in parts of Italy and among the natural wine crowd, but not something we need to get into now. For white wine, the grapes are going to be put into something called a bladder press. Picture a large metal cylinder with holes cut out kind of like a colander, and the grapes are placed inside there and gently pressed from the inside out so that the juice can escape the colander while the skins remain. From there, that juice is transferred to a vessel, something like stainless steel, oak, or even concrete, where it's going to begin fermentation. For red wine, as I just mentioned, that juice has to stay into contact with the skins. All of the color, the tannin, and some of the flavor, that's where that's coming from. So instead of immediately pressing like the white grapes, they actually go into the vessel as whole berries to begin fermentation. Now, winemakers all have slightly different variations on how this is done, and it will change from grape variety to grape variety. Grapes are put into large temperature-controlled vats where punch downs are gently done either by hand or by machine. This basically just means that the grapes are pressed very gently to extract that color and flavor. Now, as they're doing that, simultaneously, fermentation is going to kick off either naturally because of the ambient yeast that's in the air, or yeast will physically be added. Now, because CO2 is being produced, as I mentioned, that is one of the byproducts of fermentation, the grape skins are naturally going to separate from the juice and float up to the top to create what's called a cap. So throughout this process, many winemakers will do what's called punch-overs, which is where juice is funneled up and over through tubes and sprayed on top of the cap to help keep it wet and combined. Now, this is super important because the number of times they do these punch-overs and these punch-downs is going to be dependent upon the winemaker and can last anywhere from 1 day to several weeks. Now let's talk about some of these variables. I mentioned yeast strains. These are incredibly important to winemakers, and some will choose to go the ambient route while some will choose to go the commercial route. A lot of times winemakers will choose to go the commercial route because it's just a little bit more tried and true. They know the rate at which that yeast is going to consume the sugar, and there aren't a lot of risks in doing it that way. Some, on the other hand, believe that ambient is more the way to go because it's more natural, it lends itself to the actual terroir of the grape, and so you'll often hear a lot of conversations within the winery regarding what strain of yeast they might use. Another big variable is temperature. If you remember back to your high school chemistry class, you might remember that temperature can speed up and slow down the rate of chemical reactions. And that's essentially what's happening during fermentation, right? So winemakers might control that rate by adjusting the temperature. They might want to slow it down just a little bit to get more extraction from that red wine. Or conversely, they might want to speed it up a little bit and let it go quickly so that they're not getting too much tannin and too much color if they want a softer, more light-bodied wine. The other variable that I mentioned briefly was how many punch-downs and punch-overs they choose to do per day. This tends to be sort of a winemaker's secret. Everyone sort of has a recipe, and you might hear it once per day, twice per day, and technology has gotten so good that they can actually do it from their iPhones lately. It's pretty cool to see, and if you see a really high-tech winery when you're out, chances are that those winemakers are able to control that from their bed while they're getting a couple hours of sleep. I'll be back with more after this short break. Welcome back to the show. That third component that we're going to move to after fermentation has completed is aging. And you've probably heard some winemakers somewhere at some point go, this wine was aged in New French oak for 24 months. And chances are you were like, cool, what does that mean? Well, once a wine is completed fermentation, there's a few paths that it can take. For white wine, especially grapes like Sauvignon Blanc and Pinot Grigio, it will likely go into a large stainless steel vat where there's little to no oxygen exposure. This is really going to help to retain that freshness and that zigzaggy acidity that you might notice when you're drinking that wine. It's just going to relax here for a few months and get ready for bottling, and there's really nothing imparted from that stainless steel vessel. On the other hand, like that of Chardonnay and red wines, those will likely go into oak barrels. And this is for two reasons. Oak, specifically New French oak, imparts all of those baking spices like vanilla and clove and cardamom, which helps to complement the natural flavors of the wine. So it may not be that you don't like Chardonnay, it just may be that you don't like oaked Chardonnay. And for that, I would definitely recommend looking for something that is unoaked, which is definitely out there. The longer you age the wine in oak, the more flavor it will impart, and that could be for as few as 6 months to as long as 48 months, totally dependent on the winemaker. The second reason is for oxygen exchange. Over time, the wine is exposed to a small amount of oxygen, and this is for a few reasons. One, it's going to help develop the natural tannins in the grape, it's going to soften that acidity a little bit, and it's just going to help to mellow out the wine. The oak is also going to impart some tannin as well because wood naturally has tannin in it, so it's actually going to beef up the structure just a little bit. I'll tell you more in just a minute. Welcome back to Wine Tripping with Amanda McCrossin. All right, so where do some of these variables lie when you're talking about aging the actual wine? I already talked about New French oak, but there's a lot of other types of oak that you could use as well. American oak, for example, is incredibly popular in regions like Spain. It's also famously used in a wine called silver oak here in California, which actually has their own cooperage in Missouri. If you go to Italy, you might actually see something like Slavonian oak and Hungarian oak out there as well, and they all impart different types of flavors. In addition to the type of oak that we're using, we also have to look at the size and shape of the barrel. Sizes and shapes will vary all across different winemaking regions, and of course, larger barrels are going to impart less because of that ratio, and smaller barrels are going to impart more. Other vessels that you might see are concrete. That is becoming incredibly popular almost universally across many different regions, as well as the length of time. So you're gonna see, as I mentioned, anywhere from a few months to upwards of 48 months, depending on what the winemaker wants to do with the wine. And the last thing that I definitely need to talk about is malolactic fermentation. I know, it's kind of a mouthful, and it's really just a conversion of malic acid, which is that green tart acidity, to creamier lactic acid. And we see this almost universally with red wines, but you probably notice this the most in wines like Chardonnay. Now, I mentioned if you're not a Chardonnay fan because you don't like buttery and oaky, well, I already accounted for the oak part, but I didn't talk about the butter part. That butter part is coming from malolactic fermentation. And this is a choice that winemakers can choose to make when it comes to making Chardonnay. They can choose to block malolactic fermentation and retain that great crispy apple acidity, or they can let it go through malolactic fermentation and have it result with the creamy, buttery feel. That's where that's coming from, not the grape itself. After that, there's going to be several blending trials. If there is more than one grape and more than one barrel that's being made, they're going to bottle that wine up, they're going to cork it, they're going to label it, and then it's going to be sent out to you to be enjoyed. And that's how wine is made. We pick the grapes, we ferment them, we turn them into wine, and we age them until they're ready. Obviously, not quite that simple. You just heard all of the different variables that can exist even within those three primary components, which is a lot. But as you travel, you'll get to hear lots of different riffs on this method and learn how different winemakers get inspired by their respective regions, diverge from or embrace classic traditions, and have a little fun spicing it up in the winery. Like a chef in a kitchen, ingredients and place will always play a huge role. So one of the best things you can do is explore, ask questions, and definitely take notice when something looks a little different than you've seen before. I think on that note, some of my recommendations, questions to ponder, things to notice, if you see something unfamiliar, ask about it. I think this is one of those things that you can be super curious about, because even if you think it's a super basic question, I promise you, this is something we've all asked ourselves at one point when visiting a winery. And it plays a huge role into how that wine is going to taste. So not only ask about what that machine actually does or what you're noticing actually does, but also take it one step further and ask how you might taste that in the wine. The other thing I always recommend doing, because winemakers are definitely like chefs in that they love to play around and work with all the variables they can, is ask if they ever experiment with different processes and what inspires or motivates the winemakers. Oftentimes it's other regions or even wines, but sometimes the answer is far more interesting. I know one winemaker who has a song in his head for each unique wine while he's making it, and he even builds that into the tasting profile of the wine. So we can have a little fun beyond just the variables that I gave you, right? There can be a lot of other things that you may not have even thought to ask about. So, you know about different grapes and terroir and how wines are made. Now I need to talk about how to actually taste them. As the great critic Robert Parker once said, there are no great wines, only great bottles of wine. In the next episode, we'll talk about how to ensure your bottle of wine is in tip-top shape and how to figure out what you're tasting once it's open. Mentioned stainless steel will give you more of that zigzaggy acidity. Well, next time you're tasting, pay attention to the texture of the wines in your mouth. It's something we don't notice quite enough and is really important to the enjoyment of wine, almost more so than how the wine actually tastes. Notice if it's rounder and softer or sort of moving in a more angular direction. Many times this can be a result of winemaking and is something we're definitely going to be talking about in the next episode. I hope you enjoyed wine tripping with me. Throughout this series, I'll be taking you on a guided tour of some of the best wine-producing regions in the world, like Tuscany, Napa, Portugal, and many more. Plus, teaching you how to really understand what goes into making the wines you're sipping and how to best appreciate it. And of course, I'll be suggesting some of my favorites for you to try. You can listen to Wine Tripping with Amanda McCrossin on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or download the Cerca app, where you'll find an incredible array of city and country guides, travel podcasts, and more. Visit cercatravel.com, spelled C-E-R-C-A. Cerca, love the world you live in, and we'll help you explore it.